So the focus of this demo is we're going to be working from photo reference, and since the photo reference we're using is from a Facebook picture, it's not the strongest reference. It was a pretty low resolution, small image, and so we're blowing it up pretty high. Was this a camera phone shot, do you know?
Probably.
Yeah, so up close it's really, really pixelated. From a distance you don't see it too much, which is nice because that's kind of the idea. If you're approaching a drawing or painting, it needs to look good from a distance first, and then you can choose how much you want to develop it. So this looks realistic even though it's pixelated. That's the whole idea behind getting your drawing or painting to look correct from a distance first and then slowly resolving it. You choose how much resolution you want in your final picture. So, most students and amateurs start with the reverse. They focus on one piece of it, like an eyeball, and try to, over-describe it, extend the value range, extend the edge range, without considering how it looks from a distance first, and that's where you run into a lot of trouble. So this would not look correct if I started with the eyeball and hyperextended the value range. Got too many sharp edges in there, it just wouldn't make sense. So it needs to look good from a distance first. So actually a picture that's this resolution is not actually a huge deal. So you will notice though that I had one photo to work with. The actual exposure of it was kind of high. This is the original photo, turned to black and white. So you can see everything's a little high key overall, kind of washed out looking. So I did on the computer adjust the contrast. I just pumped it all up a few bars to yield this picture, which gave me a slightly more dynamic range of values in the face, which will help it read a little better from a distance. And again, it's one of those things, just like we talked about with Sargent, where from across the room, you glance at it and the value pattern helps it stand out and be striking and understand what's going on. Whereas some of the values in here are getting so undescribed here that from a distance it kind of turns to mush. So they're not quite pushed far enough. Whereas the one on top, it's pushed a little more, so even from a distance the structure of the head is holding stronger. Now the problem with this photo on top, and the reason I can't just work completely with that, is that any values darker than say a 3 in the original source photo are pushed all the way to black. So values in the mouth, this whole mouth, all of the eye in here, pupil, iris, and everything, and even the shadow and the white are just pushed all to black. So that won't be a very usable bit of information. So when I go to develop my darker darks, I'm going to have to work down here on this photo so I can see variation in the eye. I'm still not going to hyperextend the values in the eye. I'm not going to make the whites of the eye white and the darks of the eye completely black. But I'll use this as a guideline to see more information as opposed to just the flat information up top. And this is called bracketing. When you're taking your own reference photos, if given the opportunity, and you're not pulling just from a source reference online, you would want to do what is called bracketing. And that's setting the exposure on your camera to capture a high exposure, a low exposure, and then a baseline exposure, utilizing your light meter. Most cameras, such as this one, have a built-in light meter. So it's got a sliding bar that has -2 on one side, 0 in the middle, and 2 on the other side. So you can do those exposure steps. Almost any digital camera has something like that. So the 0 is what the camera is saying is what the correct adjustment of light is for you to capture the most information in the half tones, in the mid-value range. So if you're taking a picture, even with a cheap digital camera, you want to make sure you hit one at the 0, and then one at the 1 or the 2, and then another one at the -1 or -2. So that allows you, in the high exposure, something like this one down here. We would consider this a high exposure down here. It's super light. Being super light allows us to see more variation and subtlety of information in the darks, because the camera is set to be more sensitive to light, so stuff in the dark is more visible. Whereas stuff in the light, such as the bow up here, for example, is more washed out. You can't see much information in the lights. And then on a very low exposure, such as the one up here, we can see more variation of information in the light section. So we're going to want to use both at our disposal. Now this one up top here, because it was just one photo and the contrast was upped, it actually pushed the lights to light. So you can see there's almost no information in here. And there's actually a little bit more information in here. I mean, that's what a contrast does. Unfortunately, unless you have a more advanced computer software, you can't pull an image and tell it to expose just the lights or expose just the darks. Sliding the contrast bar operates both the light end and the dark end simultaneously. So you have to do incremental steps of contrast to capture the correct bracketing. So it can become a little tricky, but we'll just kind of go back and forth between the two. And in a particular case like this, we would just have to use our knowledge of form shadows and cast shadows and value variation to fill in the gaps left by the photo. So this is what they had to learn to work with in the 1800s. Mid-1800s, we're working from photos. Photos are obviously not the greatest reference source back then. It's not like they could just go out and set really fine-tuned adjustments on their camera and take a great picture and work off of that. They basically use that as a very simple shape guideline and a very basic value guideline. And obviously no color, they were working with black and white. So they would have a photo similar to something like this, probably even worse values that they would use to build up a painting. So they work from life so much that they would know how to take a face like this, which are probably even more overexposed than that, and then build the value structure on it, and then build the color on it as well. So the more you work from life, the more it will inform your ability to work from a photo like this, and you'll be able to handle worse and worse photos. It will become problematic, though, if you work exclusively from life and you never work from photos, because they won't tend to reconcile very much. You won't know how to spot the differences as easily unless you're working with them both simultaneously. When I started painting, it was about half and half. I went down to the palette and chisel 4 to 5 days a week to work from life, and then I worked in my studio for the remaining time out of the week, and then sometimes both the same day. So at home I'd be working with photos. At the palette and chisel I would see models from life, and I would be able to identify which edges needed to be lost, which value structures needed to be kept from the photo, and which needed to be thrown out. So it's going to be important that you work from both simultaneously. Master copies are the obvious choice for beginning, and then from master copies you can also look at similar setups that you can photograph and then see how things might have been changed. And even in some paintings, like the John Singer Sargent painting of his teacher, Carolus Duran, that we saw the painting of the heart-shaped head, the guy with the hair that was heart-shaped, sitting like, and he's got the hair that's like that. So James Gurney on his blog has a photograph of Carolus Duran, and so you can see how you might change a photograph of Carolus Duran into the painting of Carolus Duran. And that's a very, very valuable resource for somebody, a student, so that you can successfully utilize reference photos as well. Other than that, not much is going to be different from a master copy. It's a two-dimensional reference. Everything should be pretty similar. And I'm going to be working site size on this one. This is a pretty solid sized head. It's that 4.5, maybe 5 inches for the head, which is pretty appropriate. I did have this printed out larger on some 11 by 17 paper, and the head was just too large. It was about life size, maybe a little bit larger than life size, and it just looked a little awkward and imposing, like a huge, huge head. So this is going to be hopefully a little bit more delicate of a drawing by opting to go a little bit smaller. And as far as most paintings that are not life size, that we're going to see in museums or in illustrations like the Norman Rockwell illustrations, this is about the size head that would be utilized. So I am going to start first of all with my box of the face, and instead of doing the top in the ambiguity of where the hair is spilling over the forehead, I've opted to go for a hard line. The bow makes the most sense. In this particular case, with this photo, I'm not doing a box of the whole head first, which I would normally do when working from life. I would normally do the whole head and then box in the face. But currently, with the reference photo I have, there's too much ambiguity between the actual boundaries of the head and the boundaries of the background. So it would not be as necessary at this point to even do that. And plus, I know the model in this case is not going to be moving at all. So I can be relatively certain that any measurement I take off of the model is going to be accurate. And don't have to worry about any movement that way. So we'll start with our basic box here. Now before I go further than this in any picture, I want to develop a couple scheme lines for the rest of the drawing to ensure that it is the placement and distance boundaries to other areas that I'm wanting to work with. In this case, this paper will most likely be chopped down. It's probably going to be a trailing composition, kind of a vignette. So I'm not going to have to worry about going all the way to the end of the page. And since I'm starting with a slightly larger page, we can crop as needed to make a more appropriate design. But I do want to make sure that nothing's going to, I didn't place this so close that I can't handle the rest of the shoulders or whatnot. And this would be kind of similar to like how Richard Schmid does a lot of paintings where he just adheres them to a board with tape. People with pouches will do this all the time as well. Just masking tape the canvas to a board and then do the painting, let it be whatever size is comfortable, and then crop it down afterwards to make a reasonable composition. So I just want to see a basic scheme line here. Going to the armpits. So you can take a plumb line down from the side of the face and then over to see where that armpit is. Do you guys see how I just use plumbs and levels to figure that out? You should be starting, at this point especially, starting to get very quick at doing all of this. Because it's not going to get any easier than working from a photo. The model doesn't move. If you literally can't do a sight-size drawing or painting from a photograph and get it to turn out successful with the shape, then you need to go back to the basics of your measurements of the sight size exercises and triangulation exercises in the back of the book and whatnot. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to go, what do I want to find? I want to find this. So I'll take, a lot of students I've noticed will want to try and find a line like this, and then they'll sort of measure this way off of the face, but then there's nothing established here, and so then that becomes ambiguous and often incorrect. So whenever things can get dicey, I like to think always plumbs and levels, verticals and horizontals. They're going to be far more accurate than any angles, especially in the beginning. So I want to set everything up like angles, and that's essentially like gridding something out. So I'm kind of gridding it all out right now. So that's the distance down, and then the distance over for the bottom of that sleeve. So distance down, and then over, so it should be something like right here. Angles like this, especially if they're inaccurately placed, which that one probably is, are quite dangerous. So let's see, I'm going to go up, and then over. Somewhere like there, okay. You can also, in a photograph like these, use just the edges of the paper as plumbs and levels. I do that quite frequently. And especially in larger figure paintings, if I'm working from photo, I do have a couple reference photos of the whole model down here, and then I have closer shots of a hand, a face, an arm, whatnot. And then those I usually print out the size that they're intended to be on the painting, so that I can just pop them up here and have a close-up of a hand, a face, whatever. And then I can just use the sides of the photo as my plumb and level to measure off of. And it simplifies things a lot, rather than like we do in class, we go down to the side of the head and then measure from the side of the head over, whatnot, for a portrait. A photo is more simplified in that we can always measure from the edge of the paper or the edge of the image. And that should be pretty consistent. But you would have to establish them on your paper first if you're going to do that. Go this up, over. Gotta get this belly in here. I like this belly.
I know.
Once I describe that, I think we'll be in good shape here.
Looks like a beer belly.
Yep,
Adorable.
it's a baby belly.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be too concerned yet about little tiny cuts and angles. And in fact, sometimes at this stage, it doesn't quite reflect what you would hope it reflects in the early initial stages. You know, some artists are really concerned about getting that gesture and the feeling and the weight really, really early on. Well, that's a structural thing. And for this type of highly refined realism, you can eventually get to that gestural thing or start with that gestural thing, but only after you've had a lot of experience necessary, because you're at that stage essentially trying to handle structure and lighting conditions at the same time. Now, I could probably start that way, and I often do start that way, but for, I would say, 99% of artists and 99.9% of students, starting that way does not usually end very successfully because they can't reconcile believable gesture with the lighting pattern in the very initial marks. Whereas this, essentially, remember, it's a map, a shadow map is what I'm working on. It's a road map for me to build gesture into, and then I can decide how much I want to exaggerate those lines later on. Rather than starting with exaggerated lines and trying to figure out how to build them back to reality, I'm going to start with reality and then exaggerate lines. And this will give me something that's a little more dynamic if I choose it to be, or rigid if I want it to be. And you know, one of the criticisms with a lot of academic art is that people say that it's too stiff. Well, that's totally up to the artist. Just because it's academic doesn't mean it has to be stiff. You know, we can look at someone like Solomon J. Solomon, who had these really dynamic, twisted sculptural figures. And he started this very same way in utilizing or drawing a portrait and a figure. So it really is up to the individual artist. Basic scheme there. Got kind of this scheme going pretty well here. The nice thing, too, about working from a photo, which makes things a lot easier, is that I can take a few more liberties in my marks without having to be as certain with each one as we build it up like we've been so far. You know, I encourage you to work for a sitting and go very slowly and carefully and check your work as you go. Then when the model gets back up there, you check all the work you had just done, make sure it's correct before advancing on. Well, with this, because everything is so rigid and guaranteed to be back in the same spot, I don't have to worry about checking my work precisely as I go. So I can be a little more fast and loose with some of this stuff because I already have some very specific set areas that are not going to move in this drawing, making it quite a bit easier to dig my way out of a mess if I need to. And I'm just going to do a very, very basic shadow map here, and then get into a method of drawing that I particularly like and don't encourage too often in class until you've had quite a bit of experience, but one that will probably help, especially help you gear into thinking like a painter. So I'm basically just going to get a few boundary marks sorted out, and then jump immediately into the notan and resolve this on a shape orientation basis rather than a linear orientation basis. And the more you practice notans in Open Studio, the more you can jump right to the stage very quickly and be successful. And eventually, you can probably dispense with all of these guidelines even, and just start to develop it in terms of shape. As long as you're working with a paper that's strong enough to withstand a little abuse and correction. You know, this process is intended to help you keep everything really, really clean, work your way out of the mess in case you get into one and not damage your paper. So you could theoretically work with very fragile mediums or even ballpoint pen. I could be doing this all in ballpoint pen, very, very lightly. And these guidelines would be so light, if I was working in ballpoint pen, that they would be enveloped by the future editions of Veils. And that's the advantage of this method. There's that security built in where if you make a mistake, it's not a huge deal, it can get absorbed. The other method of starting with the shapes, if you end up being wrong, you have, for the most part, committed to a large amount of work already, and it might be difficult to recover. There is something interesting too here that I'll point out, that because there's a difference in cropping around here that there is here, the proportions of my drawings I built up are probably going to look a little awkward at first, and the head or the body may appear the wrong size sometimes because the cropping around my subject is different. And you have to understand that, because I've seen students rework and rework, and eventually what they end up doing is that this would expand to match the proportion of the reference to the drawing. But you just have to understand that there is no cropping like that. And if you're working on a major composition, you're going to have to learn to live with that. But there's a lot of optical illusions that we need to understand if we're going to be successful, even in the world of art in general. Because our task with doing drawing and painting is to create optical illusions. And if you're going to be creating optical illusions, you cannot be fooled by optical illusions. You have to understand what makes them work, and understand when your brain is trying to convince you of something, and be able to back off and look at that objectively. Unfortunately, the downside to that is that you lose a lot of the magic associated with paintings and drawings. In the same way that, you know, if you're going to be a magician and you learn all the tricks, there's not really magic anymore. It's a science of tricks. And it becomes, you lose the dazzling, wondrous attitude you had towards it when you first started. And that can be a challenge. And that is a struggle for a lot of really skilled artists, is that you kind of sometimes become a little dead inside because you're so analytical if you're going to get on that successful of a level. And you have to start pushing the boundaries of what you do. And so at that point you start handling more complex subjects or more philosophical topics in your work, so that it gives you something to reattach to and respond to again, because the process of just realism in this way will lose a lot of the magic associated with it. And that is something I've noticed in myself, especially when I wanted to become really serious about this and started thinking, you know, not just being entrenched and falling in love with paintings, but by analyzing them and understanding how they're done, stripping away the magic of the painting, and you lose a little piece of what makes painting and art great by doing that. But it's a necessity if you're going to try to reach this level of art, because you can't be pulled into the hype and the spin and the drama of this if you're going to be creating the drama of this. Does that make sense?
Do you think at that point the composition and the subject and those kinds of things become sort of, they're more the original things that you can blend to it?
I'm sorry, repeat your question?
They're more the original things you could lend to it, that, you know, your theme, your composition, your whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing, you have to, and this is one reason too why if you're going to be a really good artist and always learning and advancing your skill set, you have to be dealing with subject matters that really engage you and inspire you. It's really hard to become a super awesome artist if you're never doing if you're doing it just for the money and you're doing subjects that you're not predetermining, because it's just going to be really, really boring overall. So you're going to have to put your own spin on it, your own interesting ideas into it, if you're going to maintain a level of commitment necessary. Okay, we're getting kind of close here. So normally when I'm in Open Studio doing a drawing, I do like to have the no-tan knocked out in the first 30-minute sitting, or 20-minute sitting or 25-minute sitting, and then come back and stump it after the break, after I've gone and checked through all my shapes. So that helps me with sort of my timing. And the same is true even with painting in Open Studio. I like to get that no-tan established as fast as possible because that's the accuracy of the placement. And I don't want to build too much onto it unless it's pretty solidly accurate. And keep in mind with drawings and paintings, the smaller they are, the more each little millimeter affects the overall structure and likeness. So you have to pay extra careful attention. There's the upside and the downside of working small. The upside is that you don't need to render as much because people usually stop a few feet away from a drawing looking at it and go, wow, that's impressive. And then if they're an artist, they'll come closer, but most people are just going to stop right there. So you only have to render it to look awesome from 3 or 4 feet away, which is kind of nice. You don't have to put that much information in there. But if it's a big head, an 8-inch head, and people stop 3 or 4 feet away, well, they can see a lot more in there. So you need to make sure that you put enough information to be to read correctly from that distance, unless the intent is that you're going to be a mural painter and you're never intending anybody to get closer than 10 feet away, which in that case you would opt for a greater amount of simplicity. But then again, the challenge with that is, a larger painting, you have a little more room for error. Instead of 1 millimeter making the make or break difference, it's like 3 millimeters or whatever making the difference. But you have to now spend more time on rendering things out to make it look good from a comfortable distance. Whereas the small head, you don't have to spend as much time rendering it out, but the level of precision matters more with the placement of shapes. So that's the call you have to make. But do keep in mind, either route you go, that the likeness is not in the detail. You just have to remember the likeness is in the overall shape that we see from 10 feet away. It's just the amount of information we expect to see up close changes with the size of the drawing.
He's looking like a little old man.
Little old man, yeah. That's pretty much it. This process I like to do a lot when I'm working on white paper with willow. and that lets me really work this in terms of shapes more easily, like I would be if I was painting. Yeah. Before I stump, I'll probably get to. Well, it depends on the reference, and by dark values, do you mean
Like you have the
shadow
values of the
side or
eyes.
light side?
Well, you got the value of the eyes and maybe the value of her cheek on the left-hand side, that plane where the nose.
Well, I could just say this. I'll try to build it up to about 5 values overall between lights and darks.
Before
4 to
you
5
stump.
before I stump. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So sometimes,
lights and
depending on
darks.
the
Oh, okay.
paper and the subject, it may be 2 values with charcoal and 3 values with white. Or if I'm dealing with a darker
okay.
paper, it may be the reverse.
Because they're treating the tone of the paper as value? Are you adding that within the 5?
Not usually.
Okay, so.
Well, yeah, because usually I will try to select a paper that is halfway between the shadow side and the light side of the subject. But sometimes that's not the case. You know, for example, the Strathmore paper, the light gray paper up there, is so light that you're only going to have 1 or 2 values with white chalk. Even if the shadow map is like this, you may have all of this be dark charcoal and then just a few pieces be in the light. So it depends. Sometimes I'll have 3 values with the charcoal and 2 with the white chalk. Sometimes I'll have 3 with the white chalk and 2 with the charcoal. It just depends on the toning of the paper. So we'll do a few more build-ups here. Now I think the value of this paper happens to be about the value between the shadow side and the light side on her, which simplifies my understanding of it. So I know that if it's in the shadow on her, it's probably with the charcoal pencil, and if it's the light, it's probably the white chalk pencil. So remember, that's not always the case, and you can't just make a blanket rule to always say that, because if you are working with a different toning of paper, that may be completely reversed. But this particular paper, I really enjoy using it for the reason that on Caucasian models, under the majority of the lighting conditions we see in here, it is about the halfway value between light and dark. Notice though, I will be building this up in unidirectional marks instead of just like scribbles all over, because I want to make sure they feed or dissipate and not affect my understanding of the values. So they're like mini veils right now that I'm doing. And I usually do try to go with and across the form. The dark side doesn't matter as much. The light side I'll definitely want to go with and across the form though, because I want it to look really, really sculptural in the lights. Keep in mind too, I don't have one on me to be using, but I will often, especially if I'm at all uncertain about the values of the reference, I'll be using a value isolator. Like this black and white photo, obvious choice to use a value isolator on it. Should make it super, super simple to see what the values are. So in this case, I can use a paper towel even as a value isolator. I can see how dark the forehead here is compared to the paper towel. Then I can come over here and see how dark that is, or tear this in half and compare next to each other to see if I need to go lighter or darker in some areas. You should do that all the time. And I say this again and again and again to my students. When I was at the Palette and Chisel, like the 3 years I was there, I always had either my isolator cards. I used to get them printed in bulk from a postcard company, so that I always had like 3 or 4 on hand that I could toss in my bag. And then if for whatever reason I didn't have that, I would always be using the paper towel roll. I would set one paper towel roll up by the model, and then one over by my easel, so I could see what the value relationships were. If you get postcards made of the value isolator, that's the best, because they're usually on a cardstock that has a little bit of lamination on it. So you can I would get them I would order 100 or 150 at a time, so that I would never be short. Because when you order that many, they're really, really cheap. So this is usually argued to be the most critical stage of the drawing for creating a likeness. So I do not want to rush this any more than I have to. And an important thing to consider as well, because people see how fast I am sometimes, and so they go fast, or the reverse, they say like, oh, I'll never be that fast, whatever. I can't go, I'm too slow. I'm only fast if I have to be fast. That is the only reason I ever go quickly, is that time requires me to do so. It's sort of like, you don't do it because you want to, you do it because you have to, is essentially all it is. And you have to consider that speed is not your end result. A good artist never goes fast simply because they can. They would only ever go fast because they have to. And as a result, when I'm not going fast, I'm usually going very, very slow and meticulous and willing to put in however many hours are necessary to get the job done to the best of my ability. I'm never under this impression that there's always a huge time crunch unless I actually have a specific deadline, a time window for like a demonstration like this, or a time window to deliver a painting by. But the rest of the time, I always try to think to myself that I have infinite amount of time to work on every single assignment, so there's quite literally no reason for me to go faster than I have to. It's sort of a heavy burden to have to go fast, but you do it when you need to do it because of the requirements. And people seem to get that confused. They say like, "Oh, well, you tell us to slow down, but you go so fast." And if I'm doing a demo, I have to go fast. I don't want to go fast. If it were up to me, I would be taking more time on my assignments than all of you guys spend on your assignments. And that's not an exaggeration. But if you're having trouble spending more time on something, it means you just need to develop the stamina like any other skill. It's like a runner. You have to practice it a lot, working on a single piece for a long period of time to be able to continually do that, to work on a series of pieces for a long period of time. And that's something that I had to develop too. I used to have that limit where after like a week, that was the longest I could work on something, and then it was either done or I would hate it so much I would want to trash it. Not because it was bad, but just because I looked at it for so long that it just hurt my brain to look at it, and I couldn't see anything that I liked about it. And there are some paintings that I've razor bladed, and then I've looked at the photo of them a couple weeks later and wondered why I would have razor bladed, because it was one of my best paintings I'd ever done. But it's just because that was my stamina back then. But that is something that I have learned to develop, and it's a learned skill, very much so. And I've always described myself as a very, very slow worker, very, very slow painter. Because I like to, given the choice, spend 5 minutes mixing the color for a single stroke and laying that stroke in. That's how I like to work. Do I always get to work that way? No, most of the time I don't. But that's the way I like to work to feel the most comfortable about the work I'm putting out. I guess it's kind of like martial arts. Just because you learn to fight and kill somebody doesn't mean you go out and do it. You only do it if you have to do it, right? That's probably a better analogy there. Killing people is not the goal. I'm going to base more and more measurements off my nose here. I'm going to treat this nose as a radial now and just keep measuring out from that to fine tune the contours of the face. So the distance plus an angle of this nose should yield for me most of the shapes that I need, provided that my nose is correct. So make sure we double check the nose. Yeah, so that yields a different measurement there. Corner. Straight down. That's good there. And I think it already started to bloom out a little bit. It probably just felt a little small being confined. Here. So I probably made my drawing a little bigger. It's a soft edge. And then check some plums. There, that's good. Check some angles. Ah, my eye went out a little much, that's it. It's the, this fine tuning of shape, you have to get really good at. It's sort of just like a random audit of your drawing. You go all over, check every single possible measurement, and eventually it'll start to shape up. And it might be slowly. It's kind of like just subtly shaping a ball of clay. It'll get there closer and closer and closer and closer, but keep in mind you do have to make sure that you have a starting anchor shape that you're calling correct before you can do this. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You're just going to keep changing everything and pushing everything back and forth without affecting any positive alterations. When working from a model, you don't always get to be this precise with it, because the model will shift just enough where these subtle measurements aren't going to pan out. If they turn their head slightly, well, all of a sudden that millimeter is a different millimeter. So I'll have to, at that point, use more of a knowledge base to guide my shapes and make sure that I'm getting, I'm never, say, adjusting one cheek without comparing it to the other cheek. That's what we talk about, the answering shapes. You're like, oh, well, I didn't realize my left cheek is off. Let me go change it. Well, you have to make sure that the right cheek is also different. Because if your right cheek matches the model and your left cheek doesn't, then you know you can change the left cheek. If your new measurements reveal that the right cheek no longer matches the model and the left cheek no longer matches the model, it might be an indication that the model is shifted, in which case you don't chase the shape. So you have to keep that in mind and do a lot more with answering shapes when we're working with the model. Here, it doesn't matter. I don't need any answering shapes whatsoever because it's based off of a rigid drawing that doesn't move. So I can go from side to side and make sure that it's good, but I just started working from one all the way around to do that, and that's fine, instead of bouncing back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Oh, we're doing great on side. And more and more. If I was starting this on white paper and not planning on transferring it, I would be doing this whole thing on Willow, because these marks that I'm making or have made, like this line here, are not going to be erasable on white paper, and they would show through in the later stages of the drawing. So I would have to work this in Willow. I'd probably sharpen my Willow quite a bit once getting to this stage, just to ensure that I'm hitting these small nuanced shapes a little more accurately. I think that ear was placed wrong. There we go, a little closer. Consider that being an artist does not mean getting the shape right the first time, every time. Being a good artist involves knowing how to find the right shape, even if given something completely inaccurate. And that's why teaching becomes such a valuable educator to yourself. Because when you're teaching, you're essentially given 10 students, say, 10 drawings that are kind of in the right ballpark, but not really there. And your task is to figure out what's wrong with them, going around solving all of the problems and sort of working your way back to some accuracy with just some mere suggestions of accuracy in there. And that's essentially what you're doing to your own work. So the more you teach, the more you're exposed to additional problems that you might not be encountering in your own work on a day-to-day basis. And then when you do encounter them somewhere along the road, you're not held and stumped and at an impasse. You recall like, oh, okay, yeah, I saw students who were continually doing this and this, so that might apply to this situation. And I personally think that my skill level in teaching the academy, even over the last 2 years, has greatly improved the quality of my work, at least in the precision and my ability to see detail and information on the next level. My accuracy was always pretty good, enough to be believable, but now I've been able to fine-tune it to a much higher level because I'm doing so much. And not only that, my ability to reach those answers, those shapes, has come much faster than it did before. It was always a struggle for me. I could always power through it. So I always overcame because I was dedicated or stubborn enough, you might say, to not give up and figure it out. So I could always get there, but it was always a very painful process to do so. So doing a demonstration was always kind of like an up in the air thing, like, oh, I hope I can power through and really nail it. And fingers crossed, and you set up the model to be a relatively easy pose each time, and one that you've experienced before and you think you can hit and whatnot. But doing more of this teaching and working out problems and whatnot sort of liberates you from that, so that you have other things you can now focus on. Instead of just getting the right shape every single time, you can now give more attention to the edges or the values or the composition, the philosophy behind it, or whatever you want to do. But it is important to consider that the shape, getting the right shape or getting the likeness is not your end game overall result that you're trying to achieve as an artist. I mean, if that's all you're trying to achieve, you might as well just take a photo and go to Walmart and have it printed on canvas. So this is stuff that we just need to get under our belt. So if you teach, and it's not like you need to apply it to school and start teaching people here. You can teach anywhere. You can go to Jerry's Autorama. They have a class. You can teach people at Jerry's Autorama what we're learning in here and how to measure, or this whole swipey thing to get a really fast result. Or even people who aren't going to be serious artists, you can teach them how to take a photo, transfer the linear aspect of it, fill in the notan, do a little stumparoo, and then wow, they've got a cool drawing. And how do they do that? It's amazing. But either way, it will reinforce your ability as an artist to get out and solve these issues and problems. And I usually encourage you to teach students who are maybe not super beginners, but at least have some that are right where you just were like a few months ago. So it's fresh in your mind how you solve those problems. You can communicate them with them more descriptively. One of the things I noticed was that a lot of professional artists have been doing it for so long before they teach that when they go to teach, they can't really have the same empathy or understanding for why students are struggling on some of these basic things. And so it becomes really much more of a just fix the student's drawing sort of class, instead of you being able to say like, oh yeah, I remember how I started resolving that issue when I was having it when I started. This is what you need to do. And then you can communicate a little better that way. This all needs to go a bit darker here. Distance is wrong there. Let's see. So that distance is correct. Let me make sure my placement's correct to the nose. Oh, that's a little low. No, that's not too bad. Just cut up just a hair. So it's probably this guy here. Check the size of my shape relative to itself. If it was correct, then you check the placement of the shape. Well, you should always opt that it was a size issue and not a placement issue. If it's a placement issue, you have to erase a whole bunch more. If it's a size issue, you can usually just tweak it a little bit. I remember even the first few of these portraits that I did of the students, I was concerned because there weren't like any models I had ever drawn before. Completely new situation, And to top it off, you have to be really careful with the lighting, because really strong lighting on some people coaxes out a lot of information that you would rather subdue. And so the lighting has to be a certain way, and you have a very limited amount of time to do this, and your shape has to be strong enough. But having done this process so often and understanding the process really well, eventually, the portraits just started to look like the people. There was one portrait that was questionable very, very early on. And I took it home from a reference photo and tweaked it over the next hour or two and made it nice. But it was because I agreed to the request to have all the lights on and absolutely zero directional lighting. So it's basically, there's two values on the whole face. And there were no shapes to work with. And it proved to be a little too much of a challenge to handle in 2.5 hours. But, took it home, fixed the drawing, or finished the drawing, I should say, and then decided never to let the student pick completely diffused, washed out lighting again. So we got about 5 more minutes on this one, and then that will have been just about 1 hour spent on my initial blocking, which is a good amount of time before advancing to the next stage. I feel like it's getting pretty close now, especially when I squint, that I can probably handle the rest of this drawing in the refinement stage. And this will be a choice specific to each of you, the artists. You know, how much of a foundation do you need before you can jump ahead? And how much do you anticipate you can resolve later on? Some artists will just do the tick marks there and then just start knocking in the shapes. I've gotten to the point where now, whenever possible, I will give myself at least a little bit of that mapping before I jump into the shadows inside the face, just to give myself better odds of at least putting the shapes in the right spot. When I first started, it was just all confidence. I didn't care. I would just start with the shape and just throw it in 3 minutes, have a note in, and then fix it all later on. And you know, they still came out, but I noticed when I started teaching that students weren't able to compensate and adjust all those shapes later on. So we opted back to that more formal method of developing a line work, which has always been another criticism of academies, because painting doesn't involve line, so you shouldn't teach students starting with line. And while I 100% agree with that philosophy, it just became too demanding for students to handle the placement and proportion of shapes immediately. They just couldn't do it. No matter how I tried to modify the program in its early stages, they couldn't handle shape and proportion correctly at the same time. They could get the shape about right, but it'd be the wrong size or be in the wrong spot. So we needed to do some type of a shadow mapping to be able to resolve that. And as a result, I started to do it so much and teach it so much. And you know, I tried to be the teacher who practices what you preach kind of thing, and not just do something completely different than the students all the time. So I started doing it all the time. And as a result, now, after years of doing it that way, I feel like I need at least a few guidelines myself. Probably because I'm not doing enough of the open studio note hand sketches, because the more of those you do, the more confident you can feel about just throwing something in somewhere and making it correct. But it just kind of happened to be that way, just because I've been working this method for so long.
It's repetition.
Yeah. There becomes a comfort in it too. Like, especially because early on, and that's probably more because of my skill level early on, I would still get some hit or miss results. And you know, now that I have more skills, I could probably go back and do it that way and be a lot more successful. But this method has never been hit or miss. It's always been hit. So it makes the argument a little harder to go back to the way it was before, when I can tell myself, oh no, if I just follow this process, it does work out. It always works out. There's no reason it wouldn't work out. It's like an old friend, never lets me down. So it's interesting, with the laid paper, the natural resolution of this drawing will probably be similar to the resolution of the photo, because the paper has enough texture in it that it will look like those pixels anyway. And I'll be squinting down now at this stage. I am building up a substantial amount of value structure here. So as I squint down, I can start to make sure that the similarities are good there. It looks like I'm not going to end up using a whole lot of white chalk on this, maybe in the cheeks, and then maybe some in the forehead and nose. And I'll start to put those in now if I can grab my pencil. I think I have a minute or two. 30 seconds. Children have a broader nose comparative to adults, so we put that broad nose in there. Hit my lights here on the shirt, because otherwise I'll probably overshoot the darkness on the cheek if I don't have that really light of the shirt to offset it, because that's already helping it look a lot darker. So again, that's one of those things that was an optical illusion to some degree that I need to watch out for. Just the fact that these darks were next to a medium value made them look less dark. And again, that's a sort of empirical thing that we have to deduce and not let the trickery of our brains tell us otherwise.
What do you think the darkest dark is going to be on that?
I'll probably put it a touch in her eye. As far as the values of photos, unless the photo was taken really well, let me put it this way: if a photo is taken really well, you can copy it exactly, and it'll look like a painting. I know some artists who are skilled enough in photography that their photographs look like paintings, and so you can, with enough knowledge, utilize a camera to create the edge hierarchy, the value hierarchy, the focal depths, and everything exactly where you need to be with just one photograph. That's a good photograph, and you can use that to create a painting. But if you're not using a super good camera, or at least using a camera with a good amount of knowledge to back it up, then there are certain things we have to deal with, such as edges and also the values in the background specifically. Now, this was taken with what we call a broader field of depth. The field of depth isn't shallow enough to cause her to be the focus and diffuse everything in the background information. So the value range in the background is just as strong or stronger than the value range of the model, as is the edge quality in the background. Now, if I were to have taken this photo, I would have focused more on her, and I would have diffused the background, reduced the value structure, reduced the edge structure, to make her come into more focus and look more three-dimensional. And that's one of the things we talk about with photos being flatter, is that the value range in the back often exceeds the value range of the subject. And so, therefore, things tend to look a little more flat, and they don't have the field of depth that we normally see. So we're going to have to know that we're going to reduce the contrast in the background. I'm not going to put the darkest dark behind her shirt as it appears in the photo. I'm going to put it in her face, in the occlusions or the accents in the face, to pull the foreground from the background. If you go the other way around, and this is what I see all the time, people overwork this, lose the value structure, the dynamic range in the face, lose the dynamic edge range in the face, but they punch it all in the background, get those sharp edges and those deep, rich values back there. Well, then it looks like you've cut out your subject and pasted it on a background. So we're going to have to make sure we understand when that's happening in our reference and sort of flip-flop it there.
So on the face, where would be the sharpest?
The sharpest?
Yeah.
Ooh, I'll probably put some sharp edges in the nose. Yeah, probably going to be the nose. The eyes are, they have enough little squishy pouches in there to diffuse a lot of the edges. The mouth would be a good choice for a sharp edge or two, except that it's rolling back into shadow. Now, the nose here is diffused a little bit right there, but if I opt to push the sharpness of that edge, it's going to produce a more shallow field of depth, which is at the child's face, the front of the child's face, as opposed to sharper edges in the background. So if I work a few more, pump in a hard edge and make it a sharp edge in a few spots, this might be a hard edge, this will be a sharper edge, I might get a hard edge somewhere in the eyes there, then that's going to now push the field of depth right to her face and diffuse the surrounding areas. Now, if worse comes to worse, I could just do the reverse, leave the edges exactly as they are in the face, and hit the dynamic range of values that are in the face now, and then just, by relativity, diffuse all other edges, so that they, therefore, become harder relative to the background. Two options I can go with there. My first option that I would always recommend would actually be to literally copy the photo as well as you can, and then deviate from there. And by making some of those small changes, we talked about possibly putting tracing paper over it and then seeing how those changes might look. But with an edge, you can just diffuse it a little bit, see how it looks. If it doesn't look good, you pull it back. But you're going to probably need to take a break after you do that diffusing and then come back and see if it worked out for you. If all else fails, copying the photo will at least make it look photographic. So that's another issue too. It's, people think they're copying the photo exactly. I see this time and time again, and students will even argue, "Oh, that's how the photo looked." Well, no, it didn't. It's just a poor understanding of how the face or the main subject might have been overworked relative to the background, caused the student to not copy the photo exactly, but think they did copy the photo exactly. But if you copy this exactly, it will look like a photograph. And nobody would argue with it. They would just say it looked like a bad photograph, if anything. But it would still look photographic. It strikes me as odd that students think they're able to do what we would call photorealism by copying a photo exactly. Because if you copy a photo exactly, technically that's photorealism and it will look realistic. Most students do not have that capacity, although they think they are copying the photo exactly. And that is sort of my philosophy on most realist art, which is when all else fails and you can't get it to look right, go back and make it look exactly like your reference, whether or not it's a photo or a person sitting in front of you. The whole idea of deviating from it for stylistic or artistic reasons is fine and well, but once it starts sacrificing the believability of the drawing or painting, then it's time to start going back and being very literal with everything. Just clear off some of this. Now I need to make sure that I do not mix my white and my dark here. Notice it is getting a little darker when I stump in these areas here. But if I were to continue to stump it and really crank it in, it would start to get lighter. It migrate back towards the paper. But what's happening is with this stump here, with the initial stumping, it's going to close the openness, close the gaps that I had in here, and thus lower the overall average value of an area. We may end up losing a little bit of the likeness when we do this, which is one reason why if I'm working from a model, I would not go to the level of detail usually that I just went to before going to the stumping stage. Because the stumping stage on a drawing this small is going to lose some of that information and I'm going to have to find it again. And so if it was really precise millimeter information, that's going to get lost. You have to anticipate that you're going to lose some information when you advance the drawing, and you're going to have to find it again. So if it's from a model, that information usually takes longer to find. So I wouldn't have gone to that level in the initial drawing. A photograph, though, it didn't take me that long to find that information, and it won't take me that long to find that information again. My anchor shape, which is the nose, is remaining relatively stable, and I'll just keep modifying and adjusting based off of that. Hey, Scooby-Doo villain there. Again, a super amount of value range is not, again, too necessary in that initial laydown because as you can see, a lot of this is getting simplified anyway. And so if you build up subtlety in that initial pass, you're going to lose some of it. Or conversely, you're going to be too afraid to stump it all in and be able to build on top of it. And then that's going to be a recipe for disaster as well. But we have to just remember that saying that if you found it once, you can find it again. That goes for shape, value, or edge. And you guys should consider yourselves lucky because a lot of art schools will just go around and wipe off a student's drawing when it's going well and just say, find it kind of once, find it again. I usually don't do that. That would probably make a few people cry, break down.
Tough love.
Tough
Yeah,
love.
learn.
That's what it is, yeah. That's the tough love is the system that's produced the best artists in the world historically.
I do it because I can.
That's it. Okay. Now we'll coax the rest of this out of here, and as we do, my anticipation is that I'm not going to be stumping again. So my marks are going to have to really, quite carefully now follow the form across and with the form, because I'm intending to leave these upcoming strokes here and just build on them. I could have kept building on the base that I had last time. It never stumped anything. And then we're going to have that sort of open, transparent feel, much like an bullseye painting. But this way, with the valleys filled in, it's going to feel a little more solid as I build on top of it because I've got a little closer to the actual value range in the beginning here. Now I'm going to go back and start building this up here. Taking out some of the value structure I may have lost. Lost some of the eye there too. I'm going to have to get that again. Now I do encourage at this stage of both drawing and painting to, when we're starting to lay in these big overall relationships, that you hold your pencil or your brush toward the back end and you stand a good distance. This is something I was trying to get my level 300 class to do. This last class we had was hold your pencil or eraser from the back, be at a distance, try to affect these big broad shapes. Notice how far away I'm standing. I get students who just do this, and you're way too close to the drawing. You need to be seeing these big overall shapes, big overall relationships, and if you're holding your eraser or your pencil from the back here, then you're committing to bigger, broader shapes and changes as opposed to little bits of doodling.
Lots of times what I do is I'll leave the room at home and just look away and then look at it like I'm looking at it for the first time so I see the whole thing and compare it.
Good,
Because otherwise I zone in on too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is why we need to take lots of breaks. I like to, when I take breaks, especially in open studio, when time is really limited, I like to go outside and let my eyes readjust to a new lighting condition, and then come back inside and let my eyes readjust, and then look at my drawing, and that usually changes up. Because it takes, 10 minutes or so for your eyes to really adjust to a lighting condition. And if you've been staring just at your drawing for 10 minutes, it means that your cones and rods have adjusted to alter your values you've put in here to be the values that are most pleasing or digestible to your brain. So you're not actually seeing your true values. You're seeing values through the filter of your brain's adjustment. So you have to be continually going outside and taking breaks and letting your eyes adjust, bouncing all around the room, seeing dynamic value ranges everywhere, and then flashing back to your drawing or painting to see what the value ranges you've put actually are. And you'll realize that they're often quite different than what you think you've put down. That's one thing. It's hard to convince students to take breaks because first of all, we never want to leave a drawing at a place we're uncomfortable with or whatnot. But drawings are great because they never dry. So I could leave this now and be like, oh well, it's a base. I can go back and work it and figure it out later. Whereas a painting, if you're sort of in this stage, it's kind of a half stage, and you have to get to a certain point to not sacrifice the paint film and the quality. So there's a little more of a demand with painting, which is one of the reasons why I tend to prefer drawing over painting. Yeah, frequent breaks are required. I actually rather enjoy breaks every 15 minutes when I'm working in my studio, so I can stay in my optimal freshness. So I never go advance too far in a painting or drawing for a break. And so that's what I usually have my models set their timer at, is 15 minutes. And I have found that even though I'm painting less, I make less mistakes, and so my drawing or painting evolves much, much faster than if I'm doing 20 or 25-minute sittings. If I've gone an hour without taking a break, usually it's an hour wasted because I come back to it after that hour of working and realize that I just took things and put them in one direction, and then I brought them right back to the other direction, and I didn't actually move much of the drawing or painting forward. Notice I'm still working with the eraser for the most part, trying to pull out some of the lights. The eraser is much less committed than pencil. So instead of going back and reestablishing my darks with the pencil first, I'm going back and adjusting my shapes a little bit with my eraser. And then once I'm pretty confident that I'm in a good spot, I'll go back to the pencil and start working with the pencil again. Cleaning my pencil or my eraser off every once in a while too. Especially since I'm working in my eraser in light areas and dark areas. I cannot erase a light area and then jump immediately to a dark area. It'll just get smeary. I'll just deposit my chalk and charcoal together. This edge can get a little lost here. Even with the eraser though, areas that are technically in the light, even though there's charcoal pencil, I'm going to be going across and with the form. So this forehead is technically in the light or a halftone. So I want to actually follow the shape of the forehead when I make these marks so that they do start to read a little bit more structural. Now working with the photo, again, you're going to have to back up observational knowledge of the photo with anatomical knowledge of the structure. That's just going to be a requirement if you're working from a photo and you want to work in this method of developing structure as well. It's okay. This eye has to move up a little, I think. Ooh, yeah, you're going to shift. You have a significant shape change here. This way. And now it's going to move up. One of the things I used to tell my students in Chicago, well, first I'd ask it as a rule, I'd say, when is it too late in an open studio to fix the drawing of your painting? The answer is never. Even if you only have 5 minutes left and you have to trash your painting, you fix the drawing of the painting. So move the shape that needs to be moved. I was off by 1 millimeter. That millimeter's enough. Now the eyes here obviously are just about black, but even in the higher exposure bracket down below, where there is variation in the eyes, that variation and the values are still so close there that it does mean I'm going to render it much later on in the drawing. So even though I have that second photo there to nail some of those darker darks, I may not get to them if we run out of time because the drawing will still read if I don't put that information in. But if I render it too soon, it's going to look a little awkward. Eyes in the wrong spot. My socket was good. Here to here was good, but my actual eye in the socket was not. So keep in mind, in class we practice a lot of this sort of like bouncing around and correcting things. But the first requirement of being able to, of correcting something is identifying that something is wrong and requires correction. And that is something that's much more difficult to teach. And it's going to require you to look at a lot of paintings, look at a lot of drawings, make sure you know your anatomy really well, and also take frequent breaks. You need to do all of that to be able to detect in your own work when something's wrong. The processes that we have set into play in the academy here are very formal and sort of a checklist kind of process of determining correct shape, value, or edge. What's not really established, and it's a lot harder to establish, is this idea of knowing when you need to fix something. And that's something that you're going to have to pick up on your own, because eventually you're not going to have anybody to tell you that something is wrong, or at least give you much guideline into telling you where something is wrong. So you're going to need to learn to pick up on that yourself. Sometimes family members will be helpful. They'll just say something like, oh, something's wrong with the eyes. But sometimes if they say something like something's wrong with the eyes, it doesn't actually mean there's something wrong with the eyes. It means that the eyes look strange, which may or may not be a result of how you drew the eyes. It may be a result of how you've drawn something around the eyes that made the eyes look weird. So a very simple and seemingly innocent statement like, the eyes look strange, is only a cue that something on the drawing is wrong. It may not be the eyes. And before you go and erase the eyes, you need to try and do some investigation to figure out what it is. And always, again, one of the biggest answers that even as teachers will get back, or artists, when there's a critique and we say something like, well, there's something wrong with the eyes, will be the rebuttal, well, that's how the reference photo is. And so if it really is exactly how the reference photo is, the eyes, I mean, which again, the odds of that are somewhat low statistically, then it means that there's something wrong with the surrounding areas that need to be adjusted. But we do have to consider that a statement such as something wrong with the eye could be the shape of it, it could be the proportion of it, it could be the placement of it, it could be the value of it, or it could be the edge of it. So there is a big checklist of things to go through to actually determine what's wrong with it. Shrink a little there. Almost got this built up where we can start layering some more information on. But again, I like to do these last checks, even after the stumping, to make sure that my shapes are placed pretty well before I go into this value refinement. and adding additional information in here. Because once I start to add all this extra information and refine it and add detail in it, then if my shapes are wrong, I'm going to end up losing a lot of time, what I just done. So again, I'm sort of right now doing an extension of my shape finding stage. This is again, the stage I like to live in the longest. Because if you get it knocked in correctly here, you can really sort it out here, then we could cut the timer at the end of any 20 minutes taping or sitting, and it would still look correct. And so you could leave it at any stage. And that's really critical. You don't want to have to resolve so much shape value or edge later on that, when the model is done, the Open Studio is over, it doesn't look correct. It doesn't look like a finished drawing. And that's one of the things people had noticed about my paintings that I always do in Open Studio. It's like, oh, well, it looks like a finished painting that could go into a gallery or hang up on the wall. And it's because that I didn't leave anything unsorted. So I brought it up to a stage where it looks correct or believable or works as a painting. And then given more time, I could have advanced it and put more information in, but that's not a necessity in creating the accuracy or the correctness of the drawing. So that's something that's important to consider. If we can get it to a stage like that, then we do ourselves a lot of favors. And then we can kind of take a breath and relax and figure it out from there. Go nice and slow. One thing that you'll have to be a little bit cautious about when working from a photo, and I find myself doing it the same as well, is whenever you're taking a shape judgment, you need to make sure you hover yourself over the photo. So don't make shape judgments like this and take a measurement like this. See how I'm doing it at an angle?
Mm-hmm.
You want to take a measurement like this each time and slide it over each time. So you need to be swaying the hips. Because if you do this, then you start to distort things. And then you're going to end up with a lot of correction to do later. And we get into this comfort zone right up here where we want to just check and go back and forth. But you need to make sure you keep backing up. Just because you're working from a photo doesn't mean you shouldn't back up like I'm doing here. You need to keep backing up, backing up, backing up. And that'll help you avoid those distortions, or at least catch them when they start to occur, allowing you to correct them. Alright, now we get to start building up some stuff to make it look like her. Now I think a lot of her likeness, well, the mouth is very distinct, I'll say that. And we do have this idea that I've mentioned before, James Gurney gave in his lecture at the Portrait Society this last year, where he talked about the caricaturization of some individuals in a portrait to help the portrait look a little more like the sitter. And then it becomes up to the artist to decide how much characterization is necessary or within the realm of acceptance to still look realistic. And he showed a bunch of Sargent paintings versus photos of the individuals, and they certainly did look different. I mean, it's not like Sargent was a super strong photorealistic guy. He elongated some stuff and adjusted a lot of the shapes and probably altered the way the sitter looked, maybe for the sitter, maybe just for himself or the composition. But it's good to know, latch on to qualities that are unique to the sitter and start to develop those out to make them look a little more like the sitter. It's sort of the opposite of what we talked about with the classical idea of simplifying everyone to a standard kind of beauty, whereas now we're trying to really focus on those little quirks.
I remember when you brought in some of that information where they did the testing to see what elements of a person made them, identified by software.
By software, yeah.
Yeah, and it was eyebrows was like one of the key things.
Yeah,
which I found
eyebrows
really
for sure.
interesting.
Yeah.
Eyeballs are almost the same. Our eyelids change a little bit around the person, but yeah. Linda, did you see that?
Yeah, I think you
Did I show you guys
talked about
that?
that, yeah.
Yeah, I'll show it to your class, Eric, coming up. But it was also in the James Gurney lecture, and he had a picture of someone without eyebrows, and you couldn't really tell who it was. And then you removed the eyes and put the eyebrows in, and you can tell it was Winona Ryder. And it does come back to that this idea that we've had historically that they've always said, which is seek out the structure of the eye sockets first, and the eyebrows tend to follow that structure well enough to really describe the sitter, and then you plop the eyes in afterwards once you figure that out. And it certainly does hold true. Eyebrows are much more unique and descriptive, and also if they're very expressive of the character of the sitter too.
Wasn't the mouth also like maybe not as strong as the eyebrows, but
Yeah, the mouth
high
is
up
pretty.
there?
Yeah,
Yeah, and then the nose wasn't. It was important, but I guess there's only so many shapes of noses.
yeah,
so,
exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, her dad had the greatest eyebrows.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Like when he was a kid, you mean, or now?
Well, now, but even when he was her age, he had the greatest, pretty heavy.
Pretty heavy eyebrows.
Yeah,
expressive ones.
yeah, very expressive.
Okay.
And he's got gorgeous hands too. Now, as an adult, he has these really nice long,
Oh, piano hands.
beautiful fingers. Yeah.
Notice I'm still in kind of my overall shape shifting mode, holding the pencil way back here. Don't need to get anything super specific yet. And this again is one of the reasons why we like to have our pencils so sharp. A dull pencil, like my HB here, has now become so dull over the course of working this that I can't hold it back and reach in because I hit the broadside of my pencil. So I can use my 2B now here and come in and make some broader marks just to adjust some of the overall relationships in some of the areas here.
Changes around the mouth that really create more dimension.
Yeah, a lot of subtlety in there, but important in creating the anatomy there. So like this, I'm going to add a value in here, which is going to show how that muzzle, wraps around. the changes that I do make now, even though I'm not really concerning myself with detail, I'm still really thinking in terms of structure more than anything, or broad changes, we could say, more than anything. I am still approaching them with a super, super light touch. You know, I'm trying to do like half value step differences right now when I do these changes. And slowly approach them. So I'm not really trying to crank it in and get exactly the right value that I see up there. I want to do a light veil and step back and see how it affects things, because especially as you advance further on in the drawing, those really, really light changes are going to start to have more and more impact. And so I need to make sure they're nice and light so that, again, I don't advance too far and make a mistake that I'm going to have to spend time recovering from. But another thing to note is that I am bouncing around a little bit as I do this. And you can do this and are encouraged to some degree to do this even when working from a model, as long as you keep it localized into a specific area. So like I'm working the mouth area now. So it doesn't mean I'm just working from one side of the lip to the other side of the lip. I'm working the whole area and developing my relationship together. So we can do that very, very easily with a drawing. It's actually a little bit more challenging to do that with a painting, you know, because with a painting, if I do a mark here and then I want to bounce around and do a mark here, well, now I have to mix a whole new piece of a puddle of paint and make sure that the value and the color is right. It's not just bouncing over and doing a little light touch and then bouncing over and doing a little light touch. So it's you have to develop a little bit more discipline when you get to painting to stay localized in a smaller group of shapes, unless you've pre-mixed a bunch of colors. And even pre-mixing a bunch of colors is typically not very successful, just because the subtle variation that we would get in colors here is going to be so great that you couldn't safely say, oh, this color is going to go over here. It doesn't really work that way. So doing something like this is nice, because then it lets you at least understand the value structure before you jump into a painting. So that you do get to do a little bit of this bouncing all around without having to sacrifice the quality of your paint or the colors. Some of it's like this top lip, which need to go a hair darker. It really only required me to fill in the holes of the paper, the grooves with the paper. So keep that in mind sometimes when you're working with a really laid paper like this. It's not necessarily a veil that's required, it's just a little cleanup work. And then that's enough to push the value structure of that whole shape. Little hint of a philtrum here. So the other thing that's a little bit difficult when working from a photo, if you don't know the person, is I don't really know the true structure of her face here, like how pronounced is her philtrum. Usually on babies it's not very pronounced, but sometimes they have a little bit more distinct, and the philtrum is this area here. You know, that groove in there. And I can see that there's some groove there. And I have to decide whether or not it's the lighting that's diffusing it, or if it's the fact that she's a baby that's diffusing it. And I have to make that judgment call. If I make it wrong, then the parents would get this or something, and they'd be like, oh, why is that philtrum like that? That doesn't look like her. And it could really affect the believability of a person. So if worse comes to worse, you can always just, of course, copy the photo. As long as your value structure is consistent across the board, it will look like a specific lighting condition, like, oh, she was in so much sunlight that the values were washed out, and that's why it looks the way it does. It doesn't look that way because she doesn't have a philtrum,
Would you advise, if possible, to get additional photos of the subject, just so that you can...
Yeah, photos of the subject.
You can understand them a little bit better.
Yeah. If and this would probably only happen, this situation would only happen if you yourself did not take the photo and you never met with the model. And in that case, you might want a couple different photos of the model from like different angles to know a little bit more. But to be honest, if this were a professional commission, like if I was being paid by Linda to do this, I would not work from this photograph. I would require some either some better photographs or most preferably a photo session at least and a meet and greet with the model. And so my typical process, like the last portrait I did of she was a 3-year-old, I had her come over to the studio. I let her play in the studio for a while, let her play with Fox for a while. I let her take a bunch of poses. I photographed her naturally, and then I had her like hang out with her mom and took pictures of her there. And then we said, oh, let's just go outside. And then I let her play outside, and I took a bunch of photos out there. And so by the end of all that, I had a pretty good idea of what she looked like physically. And I also had a few hundred photo references as well to choose from. And then I narrowed that down to 3 or 4 potential poses and lighting conditions that would make the best paintings possible, where there was very little ambiguity. Because it could be something as simple as the hand was turned in such a way that it now looks like a blob in the photograph. And since I can't bring the model back for reposes very easily, it becomes more of a, okay, we're going with the best of what we've got. And then from that, I met with the sitter's, or the child's aunt, because she was available, and I said, okay, now which of these poses looks personality-wise most like her? Like, what is, out of all these poses, what does she kind of do the most? And when you look at it, you're like, oh, that's so her. And then her aunt selected a couple photos that fit that requirement. And then from those photos, we sent them to the mother or the grandmother and said, okay, you can pick from these photos which you want it to be. And that's how the painting was done. So by the end of it, you end up with not necessarily just a likeness, but something that personality-wise is very descriptive of the child. And then the likeness is just, since the photos were strong enough, we could just copy those photos directly and translate it into paint. Okay, so this sitting I will have my sort of first pass at refinement. Now normally, if I'm working in my own studio and given enough time, I would typically spend at least a 3-hour session on this first pass of features. So that drawing up there of Dakota, the first day was what I did in the first hour here. And then the first pass here was another whole day of working. And then I had 2 more passes after that. This will probably be done a little bit into the second pass. I'll stop it and then start to develop the background and resolve the drawing to look more like a finished drawing from there. So I'll have a limit on how much refinement can occur, but after the second pass, I should feel confident enough that the likeness is there and that the value structure is strong that we can just finish the drawing off from there. So we're not going to a super hyper-realistic level of realism. There'll still be some idea of impressionism here and looseness, but it'll still heavily look like the sitter. A lot of this back and forth, back and forth. I'm telling you, if you want to be an artist that sits at their easel and doesn't have to step back and forth, you're going to have to do this stepping back and forth religiously for probably 10 or 15 years first. And then you'll develop the ability to sit at your easel and understand what it's going to look like from a distance without having to step back. A mirror works a little bit, but not nearly as well. Leave this in here. Slightly diffused eyebrows here. Our sockets aren't fully set in yet as a child. I need to hold my pencil almost perpendicular here for this white chalk pencil because you can see it's so dull that I can't reach in from the side. And I'm at this stage now after the stumping where I really want these marks to be considered more of my final marks. I'll build on top of them and maybe fold some of them into the rendering, but I'm approaching more of what we would consider finishing. And so if I have these marks being really fine and going in between the tooth of the canvas, not just floating over it, making that gravelly look, then it will start to develop more of a sculptural feel, more of a flesh tone feel as well, developing some of these pores out, and enhance the realism of the drawing. So I need to hold my pencil perpendicular to actually get those lines. And then on the next break, I'll sharpen these bad boys up for my final pass. And I still have to squint frequently at both my drawing and the reference, back and forth. Starting to come out. Portraits of loved ones are typically easier than portraits of an individual sitter because all I have to do for this particular instance is pick a photo that Linda likes and copy it. And if it's copied closely enough for realism, then it will be successful and the person who's commissioning the portrait will be happy. But when we ourselves sit for a portrait, we're always concerned with all of what we perceive to be our flaws. And if you render those flaws accurately or in a way that we don't see ourselves, because we all see ourselves with this filter of either positivity or negativity, depending on what we think our best feature is and what we think our worst feature is. So most people, usually more on the side of females, but it happens with men frequently as well. If you don't hit their best feature, the angle and the way that we think our best feature is, then we say, oh, it doesn't look like us. And if you overemphasize what we perceive to be a flaw, then again, we're dissatisfied and we think, oh, it looks like me at my worst and we don't like it. So it's a little bit harder to impress the sitter when you're doing a portrait of them. And what you also have to remember too is, and this was described to me by somebody who did portraits professionally, is that if they send a portrait back or have an unfavorable review for the portrait when you first show it to them, they usually hold on to that negativity even after you've made adjustments. They go into it sort of in attack mode, and even if you go and fix it, they'll always look for something wrong because they expect something to be wrong with it. So you have to get them to like the portrait on the first shot, or else you have a very little chance that they're going to be satisfied with it later on.
So do you try to flatter them a little bit more than you might otherwise?
No. Well, you could, but by flattering, I would say just adjust the lighting to be able to select a view which they find to be most flattering. Whether or not that's a soft view or putting more of them in shadow or adjusting the pose to get what they think to be their best side is, there's things you can do. Some people will just never be satisfied with how they look, but those people usually wouldn't commission a portrait. But I did have an offer for a portrait of a gal, and after I spent 30 minutes on the phone talking to her about how insecure she was with the color of her skin tone because she thought it lent itself to be a little more olivey white instead of like pinkish white or something like that, and how she was very self-aware of how her skin tone was slightly more olive than the other people she went to school with. It was a very long conversation about this. It became apparent that it would probably not end well as a commissioned portrait if somebody's that sensitive to the shade of white that they are. There's things we can do, like put them in certain lighting conditions and whatnot, but you don't want to have to do a whole painting and then submit it to them and they'd be like, well, I want a slightly more Caucasian tone of Revlon number 42. That's not really how paintings work. So those commissions are usually best to avoid if you can. We're in some good shape here. I'm going to start to go in now and hit a few of the darker darks and build those up, mostly in the eyes here.
I think that's looking really good, Tim.
Oh, good.
That's good.
Yeah.
Those of you watching the video later on, that's the person who this portrait is for, so that's a good sign. Up close on the break, you guys will notice that the lack of specificity in this portrait is very similar to the reference because of the amount of laid paper that this is, which is one reason why I could agree to use this photo for this drawing. If this was going to be, again, a super refined, polished out drawing I was going to spend like 20, 30 hours on, this would not be my ideal reference photo. But because of how information dissolves here and how it dissolves on the photo, it's very manageable to capture a similarity here. I want to get some of this white bow in here too. I love this bow. This hair is going to be fun too. Gotta get some of that hair in there. But hair can very much be suggested, so it's not something that's a high priority. And it is good to consider that hair should be developed proportional to the amount of rendering on the face, meaning I cannot get really developed in the hair, even though there is a lot of information in the photo, just because of the amount of information I've been able to create in the face in our given amount of time. So I have to consider how I'm going to play down the hair and simplify the hair so that it still looks like curly hair, but it doesn't have more hard lines and more detail in the face. So that is a challenge and something you have to consider. And it's also one reason why you have to, again, step back frequently. You have to understand the idea of making something look correct and believable from a distance before it looks believable up close. Because otherwise, if we just launched into this hair, we would get so much information in there right away that our model would no longer look, we would look out of place. We cut out the hair and pasted it onto this drawing.
If you were doing somebody who was wearing a hat or, you know, something like that, you'd treat it sort of in a similar way. It would
Yeah,
be
absolutely.
less developed.
Yeah, and that will be true to anything in the peripheral of our zone of the face. Okay, we're going to do this for just a few more minutes, then I'm going to sharpen my pencils and we're going to go in for the kill here. I need to make sure my form shadows are softer than my cast shadows. So here, this is something I commonly see, which flattens out portraits and figure drawings. Something like this shadow here running off the nose for the cheek. In the photo, the diffusion is so obscure that it looks almost the same on both sides. But on the right side, the shadow is created, or this relationship is created because the white shape of the nostril is a form that's sitting in front of the dark shape there. Whereas here it's created because the cheek is turning away into that little crevice, meaning I have to make sure that I very substantially and specifically make the form shadow side softer than the cast shadow side. Now I can do that by stumping, that's my last resort choice, by erasing out a transition, or by taking my pencil and doing a few hatch lines here to break up that edge and create a softer line there. And that's usually my first choice actually, is to just break up the edge, because then we can retain the shape but diffuse it, the transition out a little more. Now I've got my eyes squinted, flicking back and forth as I work the nose here, trying to make sure I match my relationships. There's that philtrum issue there again. See how much of this bad boy we can finish off.
Bad girl.
Bad girl. Okay. Gotta get some of these darks a little darker in here as I refine the shape. Notice I will not be putting any white chalk in the whites of the eyes for this drawing. They are in shadow. But we just need to develop this out a little bit more, get a little bit more richness in these eyes. Then do some final edge work. One thing you can always consider is if you have a reasonably solid value structure, even if it's a small one like 5 to 9 steps, if you have that established and you go around and do your basic edge check of form shadows and cast shadows to make sure that those fall within the expectation of what we've talked about in class, and your shapes are good, then you can get your drawing will look like a drawing and look believable and really pop off the page. And you don't need to do all of the noodling. So that's something that you really have to consider and something you really have to practice. And that Art of the Quick Sketch DVD that we shot in Chicago, that process of drawing, which is seeking out the notan of the figure and then using a paper towel to swipe across and then adjusting the edges and pulling out the highlights, creating a completed, finished structure of edges and values in 25 minutes time allows you to practice that again and again and again and again. It is a good ultimate end goal for these open studios on Wednesdays. You know, starting first, just really hit up the no-tans and get really strong at it, but eventually push to the point where you can do this paper towel technique and focus on edge hierarchy and value hierarchy along with shapes in a 20-minute sitting or 25-minute sitting, because that allows you to do a finished drawing, actual drawing, or the equivalent of an actual painting in a very short amount of time, again and again and again and again. You know, it's a lot of effort to set up all of this and a pose and a reference and get a model to just do it really quickly, you know, and that's why artists tend to spend longer on a painting, and your progression will grow slower if this is the only practice you do. But if open studio, if you can practice shape, value, edge, shape, value, edge, shape, value, edge in these rapid fire 20-minute sessions where you're building up the hierarchy of edges, you know, we only have 5 edges that we've talked about, and we've, you know, 5 to 10 values. If you hit those up in a short amount of time, it will look believable. And so that should be your ultimate goal. And that's a better help to painting than to going to, you know, 1 3-hour open studio a week or 1 5-hour open studio a week. You know, going to the Wednesday night quick sketch where you can do that stumping method, it's kind of up there, several times over. It's like you get to practice the hierarchy and the relationships several times in a short amount of time. So I'll encourage you guys to do that. I think it's a very wise thing to do, because you can even do portraits, and you should do portraits, 20-minute portraits with the model. You know, if the lighting is strong enough, you should be able to hit a likeness and believability of the lighting condition in 20 minutes. You're not going to be doing your boxing, anchoring, and scheming and all that. You're just going to be shooting right into the no-tan. So of course that requires that your no-tanning ability is very, very strong. And so if you haven't been practicing that, you know, that is something to practice. And you know, that's a great thing to practice in the 2 minutes and 1 minute and 5-minute poses for the open studio. So then when you get to those 20-minute poses, you're already in no-tan mode, and the odds of you hitting a good no-tan are very, very high. And then you can just build an entire drawing off of that. But, you know, I would love to see students do that. I don't think I have yet. Most students just want to go to Open Studio for drawing just to get it over with. But Open Studio for drawing is going to make you a better painter than Open Studios with painting. That's the thing. I was fortunate enough that when I first started painting in Open Studios, it was with a guy who had studied, albeit very, very briefly, with Jeffrey Watts. And he made it sound like he studied a lot more, I think, than he probably actually did. I mean, he wasn't like a long-term student there for you know, a year or whatever, but he did attend a workshop or a few workshops and classes there. You know, Jeffrey Watts is huge on drawing, you know, always encourages students to draw, and says that, you know, that's the foundation for painting and whatnot. And so this guy that I had been painting with when I started, he told me, you know, if you want to get good, you need to, when you go to the palette and chisel, you have to draw more than you paint. And so I did. My ratio of drawing over painting held true for at least a year of me hitting Open Studios. And you can see how that propelled my ability to paint forward much more, because I was used to glancing at a scene and understanding more of the overall value relationships and edge relationships to make something believable and strong. So I didn't have to waste my time in paint. I could just look at it and know. Or, you know, in the beginning of a 6-hour open studio, I could do a 25-minute drawing and then know what I wanted my painting to look like by the end of it. They also told me to learn how to talk while I paint. which I could not do right away. I tell you guys the story about when my first demonstration for my first class I taught. Did I? No, I was. It was a painting class, and the demonstration I was. That was back when I just taught, Richard Schmid philosophy. So, and it was just a weekly class anyway. So it was like, oh, well, you just need to paint what you see. Squint, observe, carefully mix, very slowly, place it very accurately, and then go to the next shade. And so it was me spending like 2 hours or 2.5 hours painting this tiny little patinaed brass cup, and I only painted like half of it. So I'm going to look at some of the darks in here to assess what value they are, because that's going to be my base tone, and then I'm going to pull up from there. I'm going to squint down as well. The more grain in the background here will help make this look more polished as well. Another little bonus. So this is kind of equivalent to the idea that Richard Schmid says a lot of artists, especially dealing with alla prima, I would say more with alla prima because the focus is more brushwork oriented, is that you should be using progressively larger brushes the further out you go. And in fact, if you watch someone like Richard Schmid paint, he may use a large brush initially to block in a few of the big shapes, but then he goes to a relatively small brush and starts to develop things out with that small brush. But when it comes time to the background, it's back to this big brush. And that's a deliberate choice, again, to suggest more information and obscure more information in the background and foil against our foreground to make it look like there is a higher level of rendering. But if we were doing more of a classical approach, typically in a classical painting, brushwork is of very little concern. Actually, you want classically or academically, we would subdue the brushwork in a painting or drawing so that it doesn't overpower the subject. So you would never sacrifice I would say the story or the picture just for the flair of brushwork, if that makes sense. Which is sort of different from our direct style of painting or alla prima style of painting, where oftentimes the whole purpose or the whole reason people like that painting is because of the flair of the brushwork. But again, it's one of those things you have to decide what your picture's about. Is it about the subject? Is it about the story? Is it about the brushwork itself? If you're skilled, you can make it about many things. But if you haven't thought ahead, you may end up making it about nothing. Let me get a little more of this in here. And do a little bit of this whipping across here to suggest some of the shape of the body, even though I'm not really going to be doing too much rendering out down here.
Makes your face look more real.
Yeah. So these are tricks that I usually don't encourage academy students to use. And if you were trying to pull something like this off in Florence, they would come and wipe it off and say, no tricks, paint honestly or draw honestly. But certainly there is a little bit of my personality in this sort of rendering, my style, so to speak. Let's see if I can get this a little lower here. There we go. Maybe right there. And a little bit up here. There we go. So hair, believe it or not, is one of those instances in which you don't actually want to just smudge or soften the boundary between the hair and the background. That'll actually make it look like somebody has a giant cotton ball on their head. The trick to hair is that you need to do this. You need to break up the edge between the background and the hair with strokes, marks, like this. So that it does diffuse it with a closer value, but doesn't soften it out to make it look like a cotton ball. Radial from the nose. There. So that's all background. Need to make sure that hair doesn't get away from me up there. And when I paint hair, you'll notice I actually put a lot of medium in it because I want a lot of individual strokes in it. You know, I don't want to paint each strand, obviously, and I'm not super concerned with trying to get each strand here to look exactly like the photo, but you do have to pick out a few of them, the more prominent ones, and start to knock them in a little bit to make it look like hair. Otherwise, it will just look like a big blocky splotch on the head. But hair, just like all these other things we draw, has to be foiled. You have to have soft marks in there and hard marks in there as well. And there has to be a variation of them, otherwise it'll look too uniform. Start going on top of that with some white chalk here. Can't even really tell what's going on over here. Maybe a few more squiggles there. If I start to get too many uniform marks on there, I'll have to break it down and start to solidify it again, which happens sometimes, and bring the shapes a little more compressed. Again, too much variation up there is going to make it look like it's been cut out and pasted on there. So it's going to require that, again, when I squint down at the hair up here, it looks like the hair on the reference when I squint down. That has to be my overriding law, so to speak. If I were to say one rule that has to pan out is when I squint at the hair, it has to look similar to when I squint at the hair on the reference photo. Other than that, I have actually quite a bit of liberties with the hair. As long as it has the overall variation and suggestion of what's going on here. Let's get the curly Q in there that we want to get in there. We'll start hitting our white chalk. I might build this up a little lighter at first and then come in a little more firm and reinforce some of these marks, but I don't want to crank them in pure white. What color hair does she have? Blonde-ish?
I don't know, I haven't seen her for, no, I think it's light brown.
Okay. So it is more than that the hair is light because it's being caught by the sun. That's good information to know because that tells me that there are more highlights
Yeah, I think that's.
causing this rather than the value of the hair, meaning that where those lights occur, where the white chalk is being hit, should have relatively sharp edges. Highlights have sharper edges, and if they don't have sharper edges, then they stop looking like highlights. So it's something that we're going to have to make sure is built into the drawing there. And that will actually change how I handle some of this. I'm going to knock some of this down, actually, because I don't want many intermediate tones between the lights of the hair and the darks. Otherwise, again, it's going to stop looking like highlights. Consider, though, we can always just copy the photo, and if we copy the photo correctly, it'll turn out right. So that would be my fail-safe. Like if I do this and it's really just not working out right and I can't seem to get it to look like hair, then I step back, probably take a break, and then come back and just start copying each of the shapes on the photo. Eventually, if they're correctly copied in shape, value, and edge, it will look correct. So I'll shoot to do as much as I can by trying to simplify on my own. And then if that doesn't pan out, the photo is always the fail-safe. And you know, that's one of the reasons why in term 1 of drawing and term 2 of painting, the focus is specific and strongly geared towards copying the reference exactly. Making it exactly the same, because that's always going to be your parachute. Whenever I'm running out of time, or whenever I get caught in a pickle, need to work my way out, I just squint harder. If I need to, I'll go and do this full drawing with my eyes squinted, because at very least that means I'll capture the overall impression correctly. Sharp edge up there. It's a nice edge. At this stage too, you can start to actually put the white chalk in some areas directly on top of the charcoal. You just have to understand that once you do that, you are committed to it. You cannot blend it or stump it. And you cannot use your eraser on it. So that's the only stipulations with that. But eventually, it will come to a point where I want a crisp enough edge that up here, I'm just going to go right on top of the dark. go all day on these curls. Again, make sure these edges are nice and sharp. Run that sharp pencil there. Let's go back to our HB here. And then I'm just going to bounce around and do some last little minute checks. I'm going to adjust this composition just a little. I'm also going to do something which I typically like to do in some what I would consider more stylistic drawings or alla prima drawings, which is to put some heavier lines to foil against some of the more soft lines that I have developed, which is the same logic behind the softer background, you know, the more splashy background back there. It's by throwing in some marks that are heavy, thick, and obviously intended to be stylistic, it's going to make the subject look a little more realistic by contrast. So this is something actually that Degas did a lot. You may not know, but Degas was quite a bit more realistic. He was one of the few who was very successfully realistic before he moved on to more of an impressionistic style of work. And so his early work is he's starting to combine some of this abstraction with realism in his paintings, where he would paint a face that's super realistic, but then he would hit this very thick stylized outline next to it somewhere, and it would just super heighten the realism of the face. Sargent did that a lot in his drawings, actually. And Scott Burdick does it in his drawings as well. Some of these nice, thicker, stylistic lines.
So Tim, on the photo, there's a pretty sharp division between the shoulder and the background, but because those aren't important, you choose not to do that?
What are you talking about?
Like
here
sharp
and here?
edges between them?
Well, I did do this line here, and I'm probably going to go back and reinforce
Okay.
this line. And again, that's one of those stylized things.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, too, I'm not going to push that contrast as much. That's the reason why it appears to be such a stark contrast on the photo, is because of the value contrast.
Right.
I'm not going to put that value contrast in, but I am going to hit up this stylized line that's a little bit thicker, and so it'll kind of read to have the same or similar contrast without actually pushing the values where I don't want them to go there. So I'll start to do that in a few areas here. Just a few of these marks. And I've always loved to foil this idea of abstraction versus reality, and it's certainly not a requirement. It's not something that I teach very much in the academy, because it's a personal stylistic preference, and certainly not necessary. But I personally like the aesthetic of it. It's funny because most students in the academy think that or have thought that I do more of this refined, realistic work, which is not the case. I'm typically a much looser, fairly heavily stylistic painter that lends more towards impressionism. And the other people in the art community, or even at the school, kind of know this. And so the Beaux-Arts painting that I donated last year was more in the style of what we work in here with the realism. And then when people saw that at Beaux-Arts, they said, oh, well, that's not really Tim's style. Whereas the students here think that that's my only style. But it's just the only one I teach because it's very objective. It's not subjective. Whereas my style that I do is obviously subjective. You like it or you don't. Or you're indifferent, I guess, but it's open to personal preference. I want to kind of outline this bow a little too. I like this bow. Just throw some marks in here that aren't really in the drawing or in the reference. Now I'm getting to the point where I'll use the reference less and less because now I'm making more of a drawing. I'm hoping that the likeness is there enough, so now I can focus on just making a good drawing, a pleasing drawing. Hopefully people will like. Well, actually I only need to impress one person with this, so.
The hair looks great, I think.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
But nothing else?
Nothing else, just the hair.
I like the hair.
Well, it's just because we were working on it just now.
Throw a little info there, a little here. It's got a little obscured, but that's probably okay. Oops. I want to actually define this right here a little more. It's actually right here. So some lines which would have been easier to see and for my eyes to focus on, like the, this line here, in a with the actual model, I'm going to kind of just push here to be what I would want it to be if I had the model there. It's one of those things that working with the model would, on a more regular basis, would let me know. So I need a little more substantial division between the hairline than the reference is giving me.
Yeah, she's kind of bald.
Yeah.
Not bald, but her, I'm sure she does have that receding hairline. She's so.
Well, she has hair here, although
It's light.
it's so light. And this is another thing too, where with the intent of this being black and white, I might have positioned some of this, or if I had control over the reference photo, position the light in such a way that this would have been more obvious in black and white than it actually is. And so now I can really only go with the black and white reference. If I just printed this in color, which I should have done, I would have been able to see a little more of the hair just by color difference, and then I could have fudged a little bit of the value difference to compensate for that, because I could push it by maybe half of the value step just to show that it was hair, because I'm working with a non-colored drawing. Oh yeah, there we go. See, something like this is what I like. Oops. I'm gonna stump some of this in here. Again, I want it to be more realistic and rendered towards the face. And then I'm going to just loosen it towards the peripherals. So I can actually use my eraser to suggest a little bit of this information of the shirt in just a minute's time, and then just let it trail off as it goes down the drawing. And with that all foiled together. There we go. Maybe just some of these. Then we get a little information in the shirt, which is kind of interesting.
No, I'll give it to.
Maybe you could get like a clay or something
Yeah.
copy made of it.
That's what Kathy did. She gave hers to her son. She probably just should have had the grandkids drawn. I don't know too many guys who would hang up a drawing of their mom in their house. No offense to Kathy or anything, but okay. Soften some of this out just a little here. this whole idea of being aesthetically pleasing is something that's really difficult to teach. It's a little easier in painting because we have so many good examples and you can see what works and make sure you put that in your own work. But with drawings, there's actually fewer drawings that show us aesthetically pleasing abstraction and dissipation to the surrounding areas. So it is something that sometimes requires a little bit of playing around with, as well as attention to artists who may be doing something similar. You know, I look at a lot of Scott Burdick drawings, a lot of Sargent drawings, and that informs me a lot on how I would like to handle some of the peripherals around the head. But there's not nearly as many for drawing as there is for painting. Then we're going to hit some lines in here. Oops. Down a little bit more here. And then this white guy. I do want, again, some of these white strokes to be visible down here, just like they are up there. I don't want them to be completely softened out. Just do a couple little lines here suggesting that the drawing would probably go down further. But since I don't really have any information to go off of, we'll just let it trail off there. And, need some harder edges up in the hair, actually. Trail this down just a little bit more. So I'm getting sort of an upside down triangle. Upside down pyramid is one of the most common alla prima portrait techniques used. Just because it's convenient and otherwise we would tend to get really truncated. Now this has the arm, so given time, I could resolve this out and avoid a truncated effect. Then it would just have a radiating line design. But without the time, we'll just kind of give it the pyramid look to it here. And I think we're about to get some accents in here for the hair. if I had set up this pose, I'd make the bow a little bit more prominent in my design. I really like that idea of the bow up there. I need some stylistic hard lines for this hair here. That's pretty much it. Any questions?
Looks good.
Really nice.
It's gonna make a really nice Christmas present, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Good. This one needs to be a little harder. I really like to get into some thicker weight lines. The thicker those lines are, the more it's going to foil. Actually, I do need to do a little bit of this here. Here we go. Again, I can't stump this dark in for the arms. It's just too far away from my central. It just has to be very much a suggestion. I can't even really, I don't think, get too much into the wrinkles of the shirt, which I want to, just because it's, again, so far away. But we have to make concessions for time and all that. Okay, then we'll give it the old Hancock here. Now, I like to sign things where they're not too visible and they're not too distracting to the overall composition. But I have noticed increasingly more and more that people who buy paintings, especially when they're expensive, don't like the signature to be discreet. They like it usually to be ostentatious. So it's a proclaimment of who did it. And so it's kind of up to, at this point, Linda, I think. Hey, Linda, how visible?
Do you want it this big?
No, well, so my choices or my suggestions would be signing at the top, folded within the background in black, or I suppose it could even be in white, but black would be better, just a darker black line, like this weight up here, so that it doesn't offset the pyramid design and it folds in, and so you'd have to look for a signature for a minute or well, for a few seconds to find it. The other option would be down here, which would be prominent, but it would upset the design. And that's usually how it works, because typically paintings and drawings are not designed with necessarily where your signature is going to be placed. That's not the important part of the painting. So signature is usually placed afterward, and typically, in the case of most artists, historically in a very, very discreet location, and sometimes even along a book or a strap or something like that, so that it looks like it's part of the painting and not standing out. So now I would typically sign it like up here in black, so that when you look at it, the signatures doesn't pop out. But some people would like it down here, really prominent, so you see it from across the room and you see the signature first. Up high? Okay.
Tim, would you crop the bottom of the paper?
Yeah, I'd probably cut off some of that.
Like about 4 inches or so, or more?
Yeah, I'll take a look at it and I'll tell you how much I'd cut off. That needs a little noodle there.